Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Lizzie Swarbrick, who is a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow in the Art Department at Edinburgh University, nearing the end of a 3-year project about Rosslyn Chapel. Her doctoral work prior to this focused on the arc and architecture of Scottish collegiate churches, and her paper today is entitled Timor, mortis, conturbat, Commemoration and the Macabre at Rosslyn Chapel. Over to you.
Thank you, Harriet. Thanks. I'll just share screen. So fingers crossed this will go. There you go. Brilliant. So thank you very much, Harriet, for the introduction, and also thank you to you and to the BAA for hosting these talks. Even though we're not at Leeds, I hope this is a fun taste of them. Great. So I'll just kick off then. So the church, now popularly known as Rosslyn Chapel, is a late medieval church in Midlothian, just outside Edinburgh in lowland Scotland. Most people now associate it with its rich and frequently ridiculous post-medieval reception. It's lauded as the burial place of everything from the Holy Grail to Elvis Presley. Several legends explicitly deal with family burials at Rosslyn, and I'm thinking particularly of Walter Scott's use of the church in the poem Rosabelle, where he makes the lyrical claim that the crypt holds 20 of Roslyn's barons bold, each buried in their armour and uncoffined. And Scott either records or possibly invents, I'm not sure, the legend that the church appears as if on fire when a Sinclair lord dies, a belief which continues to this day. A woman in the village told me that it happened when the chapel last had cause to blaze in the 1970s. It's always struck me as odd that a place which is so imbued with stories about burial and with such a well-preserved interior should have, at least apparently, so little surviving in terms of the material culture of pre-Reformation Scotland. So, this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of a very speedy overview of the church for those of you who don't know it, but the bulk of my paper is going to be those last 2 points. So talking about all of the sort of ghoulish imagery in Rosslyn and the topography, how that relates to the topography of the church. Okay. So first, a little context. Rosslyn was founded by Sir William Sinclair around 1450 as a private chantry-type collegiate church. The building and all of the images it contains are highly idiosyncratic expressions of personal piety. So this has no parish church function. It's about as far away as you could possibly get from a Bible of the illiterate. It's intended for a select and highly educated audience. Now, as with the vast majority of chantry-type colleges, Rosslyn was also intended from the outset to be a mausoleum. However, unlike the vast majority of other colleges in Scotland, Rosslyn does not have a tomb of the founder. This apparent omission is noted in, I think, still probably the best article on Roslyn's patronage, that of Barbara Crawford's in the BAA St Andrews volume. And here she describes the lack of a tomb as, quote, a very strange feature, unquote. So in this presentation, I'm going to piece together Rosslyn Chapel's commemorative functions and locate the likely site of the founder's tomb by analysing the church's really superabundant sculpture. So the building was begun before 1447 and left unfinished, probably left unfinished in the late 15th century. I think that's the best guess so far. Only the 7-bay aisle chancel remains of what was intended to be a much larger cruciform structure. And the plan of this chancel is essentially just lifted from Glasgow Cathedral. It consists of a 5-bay choir, aisles, an eastern passage which effectively acts as the return of the ambulatory, and in the retrochoir 4 little chapels. So externally, this sort of rectangle, this spatial simplicity is really gussied up. You can see here the double rank of flying buttresses, which likely do very little to support the pointed barrel vault, which is in the interior. And of course, this extreme level of surface ornament, which Christopher Wilson once very amusingly likened to cake icing. Internally, as you might expect, The profusion of sculpture is really taken up a notch. Rosslyn is extraordinarily full of surviving images, especially in the context of Scotland, where the Reformation was both, unfortunately for me, widespread and really quite thorough. Rosslyn is not a large building by any stretch of the imagination, and time and again I've seen visitors, and indeed I've seen my own students, enter the church and become sort of overwhelmed. They get an ecstatic disorientation brought on by just the sheer concentration of imagery inside. Now, some of the sculptures here really defy the sense that Rosslyn has any sort of program, anything which works to articulate the various spaces of the church and the various functions that took place. But I think the disorder of Roslyn's imagery can be overstated. Examples of very careful planning of image placement are emerging in my current research, and I'm happy to take questions on them, but just for today I'm concentrating on the subset of them, that of the Macabre images. Peppered amongst the throng of images which adorn Roslyn's exterior and interior are a great number of Macabre images, broadly defined. To a casual viewer, these might seem just to be sort of scattered around the building. For example, these really ghastly headstops on the hood mould of the north window in Bay 3 from the east is just one example of this kind of image being used without really a clear reason for why it would be placed specifically there. However, on close and sustained inspection, I found that Macabre images are concentrated in two main areas. The first of these is the south portal. This is the side of the church which faces Rosslyn Castle, so it seems likely that it was the intended entrance for the founder and his heirs, the household, their successors, and so on. In comparison to the north door, this is both much more elaborate and it's also much more grotesque. So here you can see the headstops in these arch mouldings around the door. I don't have a picture of the one to the east, and I realised, given the format of Zoom, my face sort of unfortunately stands in for that. But anyway, you should imagine an upright, sort of grimacing living face who's spitting foliage. I think these headstops represent the ages of man in the guise of four foliate heads. So like I say, you've got an upright person, I think simply a living person, just on the inside of the door, just to the top right of your screen there, you've got an upside down head, which calls to mind for me the kind of topsy-turvy images, or at least a sort of idea of descent, perhaps. And then just west of the door, you have a dying or newly dead face. You can see his sort of half-closed eyelids, and he's spewing either foliage or potentially worms or snakes. And then furthest west is a skull, where these tendrils or worms are emerging from both the eye sockets and the mouth cavity. Note, if we're talking about how you can expect some good planning at Rosslyn, that the more living faces are towards the east, and those who are clearly dead and potentially clearly damned are in the more sinful western side. So clearly Memento Mori imagery works really rather well on a portal, where users of the church would be confronted with the physical choice between sacred interior and the profane outside world, and of course the potential ramifications of making the wrong choice. It works in the same way as a Last Judgment tympanum would, which are of course very common, and basically with countless other churches, the portal imagery here at Rosslyn heightens the sense of the space as a point of physical and spiritual transition. It's just that here it's got an expressly macabre bent. Of course, portal imagery, of course, also typically prepares the viewer for the experience inside. And that's absolutely the case at Rosslyn. A panoply of sculptures, including a great number of foliate heads, macabre images, all sorts, are present inside the church. And the other major concentration of macabre imagery is in the northeast corner. I've just marked it on your plan there so you can keep yourself orientated. The eastern bay of Rosslyn, as I've said before, acts as 4 ornate chapels. And it's here, rather than at the high altar a little further west, where the church really comes to its culmination, both architecturally and sculpturally. I mean, the visual crescendo here, if it were audible, would be raucous, if not downright dissonant. It's really so packed full of bells and whistles. Now, most attention usually goes to the piers, particularly the very famous so-called apprentice pillar, but I think the vaults are at least as interesting. And so for the remainder of the paper, I'm going to be exploring these vaults in this area and analysing them in terms of what the images there can tell us about the possible placement and even some of the characteristics of William Sinclair's, of the founder's tomb. So here you're looking at the vaults of the northeastern chapel, where one of the ribs is carved with the Dance of Death. Various levels of society are depicted in 24 scenes, and in each one a figure is being startled by death, who's personified as a skeleton. There's a small issue here in that this is one of those schemes at Rosslyn which is awkwardly split across spaces, and 2 small sections of it are now in the southernmost chapel. They're really difficult to spot, but they are there. Put briefly, just for now, I think this is the product likely of a bodged restoration, and I think we should imagine this northern chapel as having the Dance of Death on both of its ribs. I'll happily explain my reasoning if anybody wants to ask in the comments or by email, but I'm just going to leave it at that for now. The iconography of the Dance of Death, as I'm sure many of you will know, is first described to us in a lost wall painting in Les Innocents in Paris, which we know through Guillaume Marchand's 1484 printed version. I think it's likely that the Dance of Death at Rosslyn probably predates Marchand's very widely distributed prints. And it's possible it was based on first-hand experience of the Paris mural. We know that both the founder and really important members of his entourage were spent a deal of time at the French court immediately before the church was being built. Each scene at Rosslyn gives clear warning to live in readiness for death. And Dunbar's 1505 poem, usually called Lament for the Macca's, provides a suitable and, in the case of Roslyn's Dance of Death, otherwise missing verse for these images, and it also provided the title of my talk today. One stanza reads, "No state in earth here standeth sicker, as with the wind waveth the wicker, waveth this world's vanity, Timor, mortis, conturbat me." His Latin refrain, "The fear of death troubles me greatly," makes abundantly clear the sentiment behind these sculptures. Some of the scenes at Rosslyn clearly depict very violent episodes, such as the ploughman, I hope you can see my mouse here, but who's just up here on your screen, who's really being stabbed in the back by death's arrow, his awful strack that no man may flee, in Dunbar's words again. Others receive more polite, but certainly no less unsettling treatment. For example, the king there at the right-hand side of your screen, who's led away quite gently by the arm by this particularly well-preserved figure of death. You can see his bony toes and his knock knees, the way his clavicle juts out, and his heavy, grinning jawbone. Like Dunbar's refrain, the Dance of Death at Rosslyn is achieved through its repetitious rhythm. That's really where the potency lies. The viewer is left in no doubt about their potential fate, and crucially, about the importance of virtue and of prayer, and particularly in this context, of course, prayers for the dead. It's abundantly obvious that dances of death are particularly suitable for funerary contexts, and indeed many of our surviving and documented examples of this imagery accompanied tombs for example, like those at Sparham, just for one. I propose simply that this is also the case at Rosslyn, but most essentially, I think we should imagine William Sinclair's tomb here in the northeast of the church, and then the dance of death in the vault above would have formed part of the tomb's superstructure, a kind of sculptural overspill from his monument. If it was situated here, the tomb would have had to have been flat, I think, so as otherwise you just simply wouldn't be able to use the altar behind it. But there's no reason why it couldn't have been extremely fancy, brass, all of that stuff. So the final section of my paper today concerns a small set of sculptures which are puzzling even by Rosslyn standards. Those on the boss usually described as depicting the Nativity. My work on the Dance of Death and on where William Sinclair could be buried has led me to examine this in really great detail, and the pictures you'll be able to see here are from me up the scaffolding in the East End of Rosslyn. So these aren't so visible currently, at least from the ground floor, but I hope you'll be able to see what I'm talking about here. So I just marked it here on the plan, again, to help you out. So it's just south of the Dance of Death and just south, therefore, of my proposed site of William Sinclair's tomb. Now, around the curved sides of this pendant boss are three scenes. To the southwest is the Virgin. Here you can see her seated, holding the Christ child. She's also crowned. Then following the boss round anti-clockwise, you should be able to see on your left-hand image here, is a sort of trestle table with a draped cloth over it, and then three containers, I think 3 gifts. And moving around again, we have 3 standing figures with crowns, scepters, and in courtly dress. Essentially the 3 magi. And at the bottom, of course, you already saw of the boss is the 8-pointed star, the Star of Bethlehem. So far, it seems like a kind of just a fairly ordinary depiction of the adoration of the magi, albeit one which is awkwardly squidged into this funny space. However, if we follow the boss around again to the northeast, there are 3 further figures. These, in many accounts of the church, are referred to as the shepherds, because I guess that would make some sense in the context. You can have sort of 2 adorations for the price of 1. But if it's taught me anything, my experience at Rosslyn has taught me that assumptions around what's contextually appropriate are really not always reliable here. And indeed, I think that's the case with this sculpture. On close inspection, it's clear that, in fact, these figures are dead. They have hollow eyes, they have little or no flesh on their chests. You can see the way their clavicles jut out. They're not skeletons, though, like the nearby depictions of death. You can see that their stomachs are still fleshy, but they're voided, like bodies midway through decomposition. Each of these figures holds a staff, suggesting perhaps their high worldly status. And in combination with the others, it seems clear to me that this is a depiction of the 3 dead from the 3 living and the 3 dead, a popular subject of late medieval art, and a macabre parable where, for those who don't know it, 3 young men, who often depicted as nobles or princes or kings, ride out on a hunt and are confronted with dead and decaying counterparts of themselves, who warn them to change their ways, or else never be granted eternal life in heaven. The Pevsner entry for Rosslyn does identify this boss as having a depiction of the three living and the three dead, and of the Virgin and Child, but it leaves out a description of the little table with the gifts on, which I think is what links the kings to the Virgin and Child. It essentially misses out, I think, the adoration context. What I think you have here, and what other interpretations, what other descriptions either haven't fully described or have sort of tried to rationalize, is the really awkward elision of these two narratives. The three kings are, and they have to be, the worthy magi. You've got the Virgin and Child, you've got the gifts, but they seem to simultaneously be forced to play the part of these feckless nobles in the three living and the three dead. And this conflation of these two bits of iconography is to my mind, completely unique. Now, this could be readily explained as just another example of Roslyn's illogic. Masons given too much money and too little oversight, plonking together iconography in a way which doesn't really make sense. It's unfortunate. I don't want to deny that that's at least a possibility here. But there is another way of looking at this, and I think it's at least equally plausible. And this interpretation relies on what I hope I've demonstrated in the rest of this paper, that William Sinclair intended the Northeastern Chapel to house his monument, and that the elaboration of the architecture there essentially formed part of his larger tomb structure. If we now mentally insert the tomb into the topography of Roslyn's East End, then perhaps the boss begins to make at least a little more sense. It would mean that the clergy conducting the liturgy at the altar in front of the founder's tomb, and anyone visiting there, presumably for the purpose of commemorative prayers, when they looked up and to the side and saw the boss, they would only see the three living and the three dead. But anyone else, people worshipping directly under that altar, basically in any other position of the church, would just see the adoration of the Magi. So in this way, the boss seems to fulfill two functions for two different spaces. I mean, it might have been accidental, but if so, it seems to have been a fortuitous mistake. Based on my experience of almost 3 years, as Harriet said, of meticulously picking through every single bit of imagery in Rosslyn Chapel, I'm inclined to suggest that this is a slightly odd, intentional experiment, albeit in this case, clearly a theologically rather dodgy one. Rosslyn Chapel was clearly a highly personal creation for its founder, William Sinclair. The Macabre sculpture included particularly this Dance of Death along the eastern rib vault, slightly reflecting really up-to-the-minute trends, up-to-the-minute fashions for this kind of iconography on the continent. This and the elision of the three living and the three dead with the Magi suggests an audience who could really be expected to not only identify and understand, but contemplate, recombine, take apart very complex and unusual imagery. My analysis here of the surviving sculpture at Rosslyn has shown, I hope, that the founder, Sir William Sinclair, probably chose to be buried in the northeast corner of the church. His effigy is lost, but the sculptural superstructure for his tomb remains. And the imagery I've described here suggests that William Sinclair chose to be commemorated by an innovative, ambitious, and somewhat eccentric monument, just as one might expect from the rest of his flamboyant collegiate church. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you very much for that. Gosh, I visited Rosslyn a couple of years ago, quite a few years ago actually, and I remember being one of those people I couldn't even remember all the details. As you're going through the living and the dead stuff, I was like, I don't remember that stuff at all. Um, well, I suppose the thing I wanted to start off with actually is with the idea of there being sort of the living and the dead and all that dead imagery. I was just wondering, how does that compare to other similar tombs that you know were actual tombs elsewhere in Scotland?
Yeah, so as far as I know, we don't have any other remaining either depictions of three living and the three dead or dances of death in Scotland. We do have a manuscript called The Yester Hours, which is now in Cambridge Pepys Library, which has a lovely illustration of the dance of death in it. No, sorry, not the dance of death, I mean the three living and the three dead. And we know, I can't remember which king it is, but one of the royal marriage ceremonies included a literal dance of death in the procession, which is certainly one way to welcome your new wife to Scotland. But Rosslyn, as with so many things at Rosslyn, this does not have any Scottish comparators as far as I've found, or non-surviving.
It's fair enough. It's Roslyn's unusual in itself anyway. With I just want to put my historian hat on for a second. So I'm quite convinced. I like your argument for where you think the founder's tomb would be, and I particularly was struck by the idea that the person performing the liturgy could see the living and the dead. But if you were just, I found that really striking and really interesting. But I was wondering what documentary evidence you have for the founder's tomb.
Yeah, I really wish we had more. We know he was buried there. One, it would be really weird not to build yourself a collegiate church and then to sort of somehow abscond from the prayers that are offered there on your behalf would be an unusual, not an unknown choice, but an unusual choice. And we know that William Sinclair's father-in-law asks to be buried there next to the founder. So it seems pretty clear that he was going to be buried there. The only description of his tomb that we do have is from an historian of the family who compiled a genealogy in 1700 called Father Augustine Hay. And he says, trying to remember the quote, he says, and I have seen at his mantle a medal representing St. Michael, yet it being a little defaced, I cannot fully certify the business. And that's it. That's your whole mention of his tomb whatsoever. And I have to say that as an art historian of medieval Scotland, it's particularly annoying to me that apparently this tomb managed to get through the iconoclasm of the Reformation. It also got through Henry VIII's so-called rough wooing of Scotland, all sorts of things. It got through apparently the mob which attacked Rosslyn Chapel in the end of the 17th century, only to arrive in 1700 and then just, we just don't know. So I wish I had more details about it, but unfortunately there's such scant documentary evidence about the church that these images are the only thing to go on.
Have you got a pet theory about what happened in the 18th century?
Yeah.
Or there are some amusing local theories?
There aren't really amusing local theories. It's sort of the lack of the tomb. There's so much at Rosslyn that I think people don't really concentrate on what isn't there, if that makes sense. So people don't notice the lack of it so much. There are a lot of very invasive restoration programs. These are mostly in the 19th century, but my archival work has been digging through restorations where it was restored for a whole year in the 17th century, and then again major restorations in the 18th century, where the then Lord Sinclair said in a letter, "I wish to God I had never meddled with it," which is a good one for the conspiracy theorists, but also I wonder if there was some material damage done at this point that has sort of meant these things are now lost. There are some nice Tournai marble slabs that now make up the floor of the church, and I'd love to get a pickaxe and turn them over and see if there's the incision for a brass on the other side of one of them, but alas.
Not yet.
No.
I suppose I should probably just see if anybody else has a question. If you've got a question, feel free to unmute yourself. There we go, Ian's coming.
Hi, I can't see my face, so I don't know whether you can see my face. But that was brilliant, Lizzie. Very, very interesting. Two questions. One is, do we know the dedication of that chapel? Because I know in the foundation document it lists the altars, but it's actually not knowing which is which.
Yeah.
The second question is, do you think, obviously crucial to the iconography of the chapel are all the empty niches? And my own theory is that the niches, they never got round to being filled, rather than that there was a wholesale iconoclasm. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that now, having looked at it 3 years.
Yeah, great. So I'll deal with the second question first, if I may. So the empty niches is a difficulty. Certainly, there are a great number of sculptures at Rosslyn which do no longer exist. And you're right that because the building is unfinished, there is an absolutely a strong possibility that they never got round to that bit of it. Perfectly possible. I do think, given that we have this record in 1690 of a mob of people, mostly Sinclair's own tenants actually, going into the church and smashing it up. And it says, I think, in the synod records that they destroyed the idols of the church. And I think, at least to me, this is, without finding actual physical evidence of broken statues, I think that's probably about as good as it gets for saying that they were once there and are no longer. Obviously, you also get some very early drawings of the church by Sleezer, where there are holy figures in the large exterior niches, but whether or not that's really to be relied upon is always a bit of a bone of contention. I think I've been able to work out what some of the niches would have held if they had been filled or before those statues were destroyed. But I'm still firming that up. So does that answer your second question, Ian?
That's the second question. Yeah. I must look at the Sletzer again, and I hadn't noticed that. Yeah.
And can you remind me, sorry, what was the first one again?
I'm surprised that there are no fragments ever being found of sculptures, but I do know that the J.B. Bryce restoration in the 19th century was so thorough that it just destroyed everything that they found in rubble. Yeah,
I think things really did get smashed up. And also, sculpted blocks are often reused, ground into lime. I don't think there's been sort of a thorough enough archaeological survey of the lands immediately surrounding the church to really rule out that there aren't fragments there. Okay. But think of other churches in Scotland where we know that there were fantastic statues and have none of them left. There are no fragments, at least as far as I know, of the Great Doom on the rood screen at Elgin, for example, but we don't doubt that was once there. I don't think a lack of evidence is an evidence of their lack, if you take my meaning.
And the dedication?
The dedication, thank you, yeah. So we know that the 4 chapels there were dedicated to St. Andrew, St. Peter, St. Matthew, and Mary the Virgin. We don't know which way round it was, and also that those dedications were only instituted in 1523, so they were not necessarily contemporaneous with the original collegiate foundation. It's not clear exactly which saint went with which chapel, but I've got a kind of a sapling of an idea of at least how to work out where some of them are, but I might keep that under my hat for now, because in case it turns out just I'm getting overexcited and it doesn't work out at all.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Did anyone else have a question that they'd like to jump in with? Oh, Philip, hello. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. How does your suggested location of the founder's tomb compare with the position of founders' tombs elsewhere? And immediately, of course, I realised that you don't have an awful lot of plans with ambulatory chapels at the East End. But
No.
that's the question. I mean, the most obvious place for a grand founder's tomb would be in the middle of the choir.
Yes.
Or possibly on the north side, and you've got it in the northeast. I just wondered, you know, what other evidence you've got from Scotland.
Yes, so thanks, Philip. Yeah, absolutely. So I can't remember who said it. Is it Paul Binsky who says that the fancier the founder, the more obtrusive their tomb? And I would expect that at somewhere like Rosslyn, that it might be, you know, absolutely slap bang in front of the high altar, or as you say, to the north side of it. There isn't any evidence, any sculptural evidence or evidence of disturbed floor slabs, etc., that he was buried there. Of course, in other collegiate churches in Scotland, we do have those burials. They predominate. For example, I'm thinking of Bishop Elphinstone's large tomb chest, now sadly lost, from King's College, Aberdeen, or perhaps the finest maybe even piece of sculpture, I might say, from late medieval Scotland, Bishop Kennedy's completely wonderful tomb on the northeast of the choir at St Salvator's, which is contemporaneous with Rosslyn. You do get others. At Corstorphine, the founder asks to be buried a little further west. In fact, the easternmost slot is reserved for his son, which I think is very generous of him as a founder. You're right that that would be the pattern of normal pattern of burials in Scotland, but it is just so it's so extraordinary to me that this northeast chapel would just really keep going back to these images of death, that I do think it would make a very, very neat sense to have it just there. But as you say, as again at Rosslyn, it wouldn't be following the normal way of things.
Well, thank you very much indeed. No, I mean, I think you put forward a very good argument. I was just interested to know what the comparative evidence was. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Rose, I can see you now. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, Harriet. Thanks. I know nothing about this at all, but I was just wondering if there was any matching sculpture. Because if you have the sculpture that's about how awful death is there any intercessionary sort of sculpture? So you obviously have the Virgin in one particular version. So are there more examples like that? So could you find a different place if we thought about giving the prayers rather than the threat of death? Or maybe that's just optimistic, because I wouldn't know.
I mean, it's absolutely stuffed full of images, Rosslyn, and there are, of course, wonderful intercessionary ones. One thing that your question brings to mind immediately is that around the three piers which separate now these retrochoir chapels from the ambulatory passage, a beautiful set of musical angels, and musical angels interspersed with skulls as well. So that gives a sense, I think, of I know Rosslyn, it's a lore unto itself, but it gives a sense, I think, of a preparedness for death, but also the sort of joyful musicality, reflecting, of course, Psalm 150, beautiful hymns for the glory of God, and of course for prayers for salvation. There are also images of the Passion, but again, they're kind of dotted around the church. Unfortunately, sort of, for me at least, it would make for lovely evidence, but the other pendant bosses in the retrochoir are purely foliate. There's absolutely no imagery on them. I feel like with Rosslyn, so often it's the case that you can go so far with an interpretation and you just can't quite really pin it down, because just where the building you expect something is exactly where it doesn't give it to you. But yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. It's fascinating. Thank you.
And double check if anybody else has any questions for Lizzie. think, since I can't see anybody else unlocking themselves, Lizzie, I'm going to thank you again for a fascinating paper and ask you importantly, when are you publishing your stuff on Rosslyn to counteract all the Da Vinci Code stuff?
It's an excellent question. Yeah, my Livyhume, like you say, I'm getting to the end of my 3 years, but I've had to take almost an entire year off in the middle of that for ill health. So everything is a little slower than it could be. And of course, I've just come back to work to have the pandemic, which means I can't go anywhere. I did have all my research travel planned to Bruges and Orkney and all sorts of wonderful places just between March and August this year, which was, I think, particularly bad luck. But yeah, I'm slowly tapping away at my computer in my home office, otherwise known as the only table in my house, and yeah, hope to get the hope is to get a sort of big chunko monograph out on Rosslyn. Like you say, there's all sorts of quite crazy stories about the church, but there is no sort of full-length academic study of it yet, of its medieval art and architecture. That is, there's a great book by Angelo Maggi on the post-medieval reception of Rosslyn. But yeah, I am hoping for that, and perhaps a smattering of articles. And I hope that this will provide the sort of basis of one of those articles.
Yes, well, we'll have to make sure we keep the description of the video up to date so they can find you once you're published. Well,
yeah,